We should have charged for this. Thank you, folks. Two of our finest, I'm very proud of them. We're not going to take a break. We only have about a half an hour. So let's open it up. I assume this is provoked. So, ideas, thoughts, questions, whatever. John.
A question for Professor Ginter. Why is it that Israel would abhor any rapprochement with the United States and Iran if the outcome would be a more reasonable Iran? I can't think of anything that they would more not like to see.
I think if you were to tell the Israelis, we're going to come up with a more moderate Iran, they'd say, yeah, that sounds great. But if you tell the Israelis, we're going to start negotiating with Iran tomorrow, they'd say, no, that's bad. I don't believe that they have any faith in negotiations. And I think they would try to use they like the negotiating model that they followed with the Palestinians. Actually, the Israelis and the Palestinians are on exact opposite sides. The Palestinians want a solution, but they don't want to negotiate. The Israelis only want to negotiate. They never want a solution. I don't. So, but let me take this one step further beyond your question. Here is my. You think I said some crazy fantasies up there? Listen to this one. Here is the relationship that can completely transform the Middle East. It's not possible now. Israel and Iran. Persians and Jews have a rich history of cooperation all the way back to King Cyrus liberating the Jews from their Babylonian captivity. More recently, even when the Shah was in power, there were good relations. Both of those countries have also interests in common. They have a view of Arabs, which is, what would you say, their admiration for the Arab people is a little bit limited, both of them. And I'll tell you something, Israel is the fundamental driver of the anti-Iran panic in Washington. If Israel, for whatever reason, were to come to Washington tomorrow and say, we're not worried about Iran anymore. It's okay, we can let them do what they're doing. I think all the air would go out of the anti-Iran balloon in Washington. So I think the idea of a peaceful, domesticated Iran would be fine for Israel, except for one fact, which is that the only way you're going to get that is to recognize Iran's interests and to give Iran something, to give Iran power commensurate with its size and its history and its position in the region. I don't think Israel wants to do that, and I don't think the United States wants to do that. Until we are ready to do that, these negotiations will never succeed.
Nick, I'd like you to comment on this, and maybe ask both of you to comment, if you want to, on the emergence of Olmert post-acquittal cum conviction, with a attitude which sounds a lot more, Steve, like the one you're expressing than the one you're getting from the president or any political issue.
I'd be happy to. Governor, if I could just, with the greatest respect, disagree with my fellow member of Red Sox Nation. I think the Israeli political spectrum right now is much more diverse in the subject of Iran than I think Steve believes it is. The Israelis have just pulled back, Prime Minister Netanyahu, from a confrontation with Iran. He announced, when he was at the UN, he had that Wile E. Coyote cartoon of the bomb. You all remember that? Everyone focused on the bomb, but what he announced is that he was essentially going to defer to the United States and to President Obama on this, and not go to war with Iran. And why did he do that? Because President Shimon Peres, 89 years old, made a speech, a senior figure in Israeli society, saying we shouldn't go to war against the wishes of the United States. Ehud Barak, the defense minister, the second most powerful politician, pulled away from Netanyahu publicly and said, I don't support something that President Obama doesn't support. And I just spent this past weekend at Harvard meeting with a group of Israeli leaders, very senior people, and it was striking how much they do want the United States to negotiate with Iran. Now, they want to resolve the problem, but they all understand that we're far better off negotiating first, so I disagree with Steve on that. And I just say, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister. He was on trial for 2 different corruption charges, acquitted of 1. He's facing the lesser charges now. Prime Minister Netanyahu has called elections for January 22. They call him the King of Israel now. He's in a very strong political position. But if Olmert were were to align himself with some other political leaders, opposition leaders like Tzipi Livni or Barak, in an all-party anti-Netanyahu, anti-Likud coalition, it could be very interesting. I don't know if it'll happen, but it could be interesting. Final point, I just wanted to say, and to disagree with Steve again with the greatest of respect, President Bush tried very hard to negotiate with Iran, not in 2003. That was the time of this fax that appeared from the Iranians. No known author, no name signed with it. But in 2006, 7, and 8, I was there. I was the point person on negotiations. We made very credible offers along with the Russians, Chinese, British, French, and Germans. The 6 of us made an offer to Ali Larijani, who is the Supreme Leader's, now the Speaker of the Majlis, Supreme Leader's representative. We thought they were going to accept the offer in June 2006 and September 2007. They walked away because Ahmadinejad blocked them both times. President Obama has gone well down the road toward negotiations, and Ahmadinejad wanted to negotiate, but Larijani pulled him back because they're rivals politically. So the real problem here is that the Iranians are not united, and they're feuding with themselves about whether to talk to us. We've had 2 American presidents who would definitely been at the negotiating table. I had hoped to be there with Secretary Condi Rice as one of the American negotiators. We were very disappointed. They've walked away from negotiations.
Who's next?
Thank you both for speaking to us today, and to Professor Bluestone and everybody else for organizing these events. My name is Ali Reza Olia. I'm a undergraduate here at Northeastern, and I also think that eventually a compromise will be established between Iran and the United States, but mainly due to the sanctions regime that exists today, because it's increased the, as you said, Professor Kinzer, the hardships of the Iranian people, and it's increased the pressure on Ayatollah Khamenei. And so I think that the time is really right for certain incentives to be made to Iran to reach a solution. But I also would like to allude back to what Professor Burns mentioned. There have been certain proposals made to Iran that they've rejected, and that's because, similar to the United States, Iran isn't a monolithic state. It has multiple groups within the government that are interested in their own political standing. And so the same institutional enmity that exists here in the United States that prevents it to making compromises towards Iran also exists in Iran. For example, in 2009, one of the reasons why American outreaches had failed was because the hardline Ahmadinejad government was unwilling to reach out and make a deal because it feared the domestic repercussions it would face. So I suppose my question to both of you is that now that we've realized there's a good potential opening to reach a solution post-American election and pre-Iranian election in the summer of 2013, I'm wondering what specific incentives or concessions or whatever you both had in mind the P5+1 could make that would be acceptable and incentivizing to Iran, but also acceptable to our other allies and in the Middle East in particular, and of course to our own interests.
Well, you just asked me to lay out what the final agreement with Iran should look like, and I haven't quite gotten that far yet. I'm not sure that I see a great opening there. I would agree for negotiations now. I would agree that in both capitals there's a lot of debate about what to do. And I think there are people in both capitals who are deeply invested in the hostility between the United States and Iran. So it's difficult for each side even to get its own act together, much less to negotiate with each other. Maybe the first job of the president should be to try to marshal a coalition in Washington to support whatever the policy is that he wants to promote.
Nick?
Ali, thank you for your question. It's a good one. I was part of the international negotiations for 3 years on Iran. Here's what we offered publicly on June 1st, 2006. And this is Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, and the US together in Vienna, Austria. We said we recognize the right of the Iranian people and government to civil nuclear power. We would be willing to help them create a civil nuclear power system for peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We're willing to actually help construct the nuclear reactors. We will supply the nuclear fuel that would come from Russia, Germany, or France. But we would take back the spent fuel because we didn't want the Iranians to have access to the entire enrichment process and reprocessing system. We didn't want them to surreptitiously develop nuclear weapons technology. The Iranians turned that down flat. And basically nothing's moved since then because President Obama and President Bush have had an identical position. Where's the deal going to come? Here's what I'd speculate. I think the international community, these 6 countries, the 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, would at some point be willing to offer even limited enrichment to Iran. So it could control its own fuel cycle. It would be able to enrich uranium, but not to weapons grade. So there'd be caps on it, in return for which Iran would have to submit to 24/7 International Atomic Energy Agency intrusive inspections. That's a good deal because it gives Iran civil nuclear power. It denies it a nuclear weapon, but we get the benefit of transparency. President Reagan used to say, trust, verify. So on that principle, I believe that's probably within the zone of where the Western international powers, not just Western, China's part of it, would go. The big question is Iran. Because, we've been down this road many times with them. And they've said they'd show up in New York or someplace to negotiate. They never show up. Why? Because of their fractured political system. Much worse than the United States. And I think all roads are going to point to the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. Ahmadinejad, as you know, is a discredited figure. I actually have been invited to these same affairs, and I don't go. Because I don't want to meet with someone like that. And so I don't go. But he's discredited, he's yesterday's story. Whoever is elected president of Iran will not be calling the shots. It'll be the Supreme Leader. He's a reclusive figure. Steve probably knows more about him than I do. He doesn't meet with foreigners. He doesn't travel. He's not sophisticated about the world, but we know he's paranoid about the United States. So despite our best intentions, even if we get to the negotiating table, the real problem is, who are we negotiating with, and will this guy, the Supreme Leader, actually be willing to commit himself to a peaceful resolution? I have my doubts, but I'm for negotiations, and I'm for compromise. I agree with Steve. I just don't know if the Iranians will pull the trigger on a final deal.
Let me jump in for a second. In considering these negotiations, you were part of the team. Did the agenda go beyond nuclear energy? Did you talk about other aspects of not only our relationship with Iran, but what we might hope Iran would do in a kind of positive way in the Middle East? Or they pretty much focused on.
Here's the really sad and tragic part of this, Governor. We never got to negotiating table. So Secretary Rice never got to negotiations, and I was.
Do you think
we never got there.
Would we have been prepared to have a somewhat broader agenda, you think?
That wasn't our intention going in, but here's what I think would have happened, if I can just extrapolate.
Right.
If the Iranians had said, if we got to the table, if we were negotiating, there was a process, there was some energy, the Iranians had said, well, we need to talk about other issues, I don't think we would have excluded that possibility. So at the same time that we were trying to negotiate on nuclear issues, we did arrange a meeting, public meeting, with our ambassador to Iraq at the time, with the Iranian ambassador to Iraq. In 2002, after the fall of the Taliban, we actually spent a couple of months working with Iran to establish the Karzai government. So there have been times that we worked with them, but we've never
constructively involved.
Yeah, they were according to Jim Dobbins, who was the American negotiator, who's written a book about this, he says that he was able to work with them on a constructive basis. So I agree with Steve's major point. Steve's right that Iran is the central country in the Middle East, along with Iraq and Egypt. And long term, we ought to be wanting to work with Iran. We've got to get past this nuclear issue and their support for terrorism. The only way to do that, I think, is to talk to them first and try to enter into a long-term conversation. They'll be compromise is going to be essential. I think we ought to be willing to compromise to a certain point. We can't give away the store, and that's where diplomacy is so difficult.
Who's next?
Thank you so much for being on the It's really an honor to have you both. My name is Miguel de Corral. I'm an undergraduate student here studying international affairs. I wanted to ask you, I guess both, Professor Kinzer, you talked about Syria and how Iran could be a constructive force, and I wanted to ask you about a specific thing. President Morsi of Egypt has recently started a very dynamic new foreign policy for Egypt, and part of it has been a sort of rapprochement with Iran. He visited Tehran for the Narmada Movement Summit, and one of the things he proposed in Tehran and then in Mecca was a quartet, basically, of Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran to sit down and sort of negotiate a regional solution for Syria. And I wanted to ask you, is this a good strategy is a regional solution a good strategy? Can Iran be a helpful actor in this respect by not having sort of the West or the U.S. directly there? And should the U.S., because this might be an interesting option, should it be passively or in the background supporting such an initiative, such a regional solution?
I think that's a wonderful idea. I believe that we should be relying more on countries in the region that know that part of the world better than we do. We have a strong, faithful partner in Turkey. The new government in Egypt has built up some quick credibility quite widely across the Arab world. If there were such a quartet negotiation, I think the United States would be more or less at the table, since Saudi Arabia always coordinates its policies on these matters with us. I believe that there's not going to be any solution in Syria unless it's a regional solution. And I believe that requires the involvement of Iran, and it will also require the involvement of American allies like Saudi Arabia.
Who's next?
Hi, my name is Jabir, I'm from Kuwait, and there's a lot of talks in the region that the actual issue between Iran and the Iranian issue is not really an issue between Iran and, for example, the GCC states or the general Middle East region. It is still like a lot of people are saying it's still an issue. A lot of people are saying that Iran is backed up by China and Russia, and the China and Russia anyway are pushing for Iran to become the hegemon of the region, whereas the U.S. and the European Union are pushing for Turkey to become the hegemon of the region. So a lot of people in the region are saying that even though I personally believe the Cold War ended, a lot of people are saying the Cold War did not end anyway, but they're using smaller nations as tools in order for them to to have I don't know how to say it, but like a post-Cold War in the Middle East issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good question. But I don't think it's going to come to pass. I don't think that the Chinese are only interested in one thing. They're a mercantilist government. They're interested in oil and their bottom line. That's why they're interested in Iran. They have no interest in making Iran the greatest power in the Middle East. The Russians are very distrustful of Iran. And the Russians have been very cooperative with the United States in denying Iran, say, sophisticated Russian military technology. They pull back from supplying that. I think the real problem in your part of the world is a growing Shia-Sunni divide. You've lived it. We saw that in Bahrain, and we certainly see it in Syria. The real problem in Syria is that there is a proxy war. Iran is stoking the war in Syria. Why? Because Iran wants Assad to survive. It wants the landline to connect to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to Hamas in Gaza. And so one of the reasons why strategically it's in our interest to see Assad fall, we need to deal the Iranians a blow to their credibility and to their strength. Iran is an adversary of the United States, and Iranian influence is not positive for us. We certainly want to see the Iranians defeated there. We also don't want to see this Shia-Sunni divide, though, explode. And that's the problem with the wider war in Syria. And it does put some pressure on us not to be inert. And we've been pretty inactive. But to think of how we could work with Turkey, with the Saudis, with the Qataris and some of the other Gulf states to try to bring down Assad, that's in our interest, to stem, to prevent an expansion of the Syrian civil war.
Steve, a response?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Russia and China are behind all this. I do think there are proxy wars in the Middle East. There is a big jousting for position, for hegemonic power. Saudi Arabia has hegemonic ambitions. Iran has hegemonic ambitions. But something has changed from the old days in the Middle East and Cold War days. There used to be a time when the dictator, who essentially owned the country, could, with his own signature, decide, my country is on this side now. Nasser wakes up one day and says, oh, I don't want to be pro-American. I say, Egypt's going to be pro-Russian now. One day to the next, everything changes. That's not possible anymore. Right now, countries are only willing to come under the wing of, let's say, larger powers if the people in those countries want that. Now, most people in the Middle East do not want to live like people in Iran, and they do not want to live like people in Saudi Arabia. What they really like to live like is people in Turkey. That's the great draw of Turkey, is just that every person in the Middle East is looking at Turkey and saying, why can't we have a government like that? Why can't we have a booming economy and an open society? And that's where I think Turkey has influence. Its hegemonic ambitions are based on an offer that people in the Middle East are interested in. Saudi Arabia and Iran have nothing in the way of their domestic society that attracts anyone in the Middle East.
If I could just add, I'm in violent agreement. Steve knows, Steve's one of our great experts on Turkey in the United States. He's absolutely right about this. And what's really interesting, think about the fact that Turkey now is more powerful and influential than Britain, France, or Germany in the Middle East. How's that for change? And we're seeing it. Turkey is the rising power. It's virtuous in many ways, although not without its problems, and it's our friend and ally. So we ought to be basing a lot of our policy with and through the Turks.
Yeah, Nick, I assume you agree with Steve that it's because Turkey is Turkey these days. That is, it's a kind of model to which these folks can look for the kind of society and kind of government they want. Without that, it wouldn't happen.
The one danger is that there's some fear in the Middle East of the neo-Ottomanism, that Turkey is trying to reestablish something that existed a long time ago, and there's some people that ended badly. On the other hand, I've been to many places in the world, not even outside the Middle East like Yugoslavia, where people still have good collective memories of the time when Ottoman society allowed all sorts of variety and diversity. So I do think that Turkey has an attractive power based mainly on the strength of its society.
Who's next? John, where are you?
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much. I have two questions actually for both.
Please.
Mariam Raqib, I graduated from the Law Policy and Society program with a PhD, now it's law and public policy, as you know. I want to bring us back to Afghanistan, if possible, with my two questions.
Can everybody hear?
After
You can speak more loudly.
after 11 years, after 11 long years, we've come to the conclusion that the U.S. military policy has failed in Afghanistan. And the alternative then regarding the window of opportunity between now and 2014 is to negotiate with the various parties. Presumably this would include the Taliban, of course, Pakistan, Iran, of course the neighboring countries, and the government in Afghanistan. I would like Ambassador Burns to please address what such negotiations would entail, given the time constraints we have right now, but please keep in mind the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, very dangerous, with a proxy war taking place on the eastern coast of the country, on the eastern borders of the country in Nurdistan, and a host as well, with very little U.S. military presence, by the way, and very little Afghan security forces. And the Taliban, that they're not a unit. We have the Haqqani groups, we have the Gulbidin who are also supporting them. By the way, former friends of the United States from the 1980s. So this is a very complex relationship. How will that be addressed in these negotiations? And Professor Kinzer, I have a question, very quick one for you as well. Given the fact that the United States has had such a detrimental role on the events in Afghanistan during my lifetime specifically, and the devastation it has caused to the population, after 2014, it is best to leave the country, to evacuate it, to leave it aside. But does it not have, is it not, since it is complicit in its downfall, does it not have some responsibility still? Thank you.
Nick, why don't you keep going?
Thank you very much for your question. And I guess with great respect, I would take issue with the way you started the question to me, that the United States had failed. Our military failed. I beg to differ. We went in on October 7th, 2001, within 6 weeks, we got the Taliban out of power. And that was I would say, evil regime for the people of Afghanistan. We gave the people of Afghanistan in many parts of the country 11 years to build a new society, a more pluralistic society. We built schools. Girls returned to school. They had not, as you well know, had not been allowed to go to school. We have spent on average $100 billion a year to support your government, to train your army, to build roads, to build hydroelectric plants, to do all sorts of things. And I don't think that's failure. We have we weakened Al-Qaeda on your border with Pakistan, and we killed the leader of Al-Qaeda, who was our enemy. So in that sense, I think our military has done extraordinary work, and they deserve to be thanked for that. The problem is, we cannot bring this war to a conclusion through fighting. Most wars don't end the way the Second World War ended in Berlin and Tokyo. That was unusual. Most end with an armistice or a peace conference or negotiations. We're not willing to put 1 million American troops in to occupy the country forever, and you don't want that, and you shouldn't want it. So we're going to have to sue for peace. I didn't consider this an American defeat. I disagree with Steve on that. I think it's going to be, a very complex, messy era in American history. Very different from Iraq, I think. We've done our best. But I don't think you want us to leave completely. President Obama's judgment is, if we pull out the bulk of American combat forces, we should leave some forces for counter-terror operations against Al-Qaeda, against the Haqqani network, against Hekmatyar, and some of the other radicals. The Afghan people and government want that. The Afghan government is pleading with us to stay beyond 2014. The question is, will the American people want to stay? Will the Congress want to fund it? So I just defend our involvement in that very messy, problematic war from that perspective. On negotiations, I won't belabor this. We could design an entire course at Northeastern or Harvard or BC on how to negotiate an end to the war. It's going to be very difficult. I think you're right. Who will have to be at that table? The Taliban, President Karzai or his successor, the Afghan government, Pakistan, Iran will have to be at the table. I agree with Steve. Iran's too important to exclude from this conversation. China is making multi-billion-dollar investments in mining in the central part of Afghanistan. And Russia, because Russia's very influential in many ways, and the United States. You probably can't exclude India. Although Pakistanis don't want the Indians right at the table, maybe in some other capacity. I think if you bring in the major regional powers, you have a shot at some kind of a deal for a ceasefire. Will it last? Probably not. I think Steve's pessimism is right, objectively. But at least you give the Afghan people a chance. That's what negotiations will be all about. And it will allow the United States to take the bulk of our military away with the 60 other countries who've been there with us, from the Middle East, Arab countries in there, from NATO, and from Asia. This is a really big deal. But I would just urge you to reflect on whether or not the United States has failed and remember all the good things we've done in that country.
Absolutely. But at the same time, you have to remember that the Afghans don't think that the current regime in Afghanistan is a legitimate government. Karzai and his so-called democratically elected members of parliament, they are also warlords, current warlords, also former warlords.
Comment is existing, the current government in Afghanistan, a legitimate government itself for a variety of reasons. Steve, a quick comment, then I want to go to one last question before we
Yeah, I'll make this very quick. You asked me whether the United States has some obligation to Afghanistan. Yeah, I think we do. I think we have a great moral obligation. And I do think that it was largely our work that threw Afghanistan into the horror that it's in now. How do you do that, though? I'm wondering, you cannot send aid to countries against the will of the country's government. You have to be able to have a structure to provide projects. And we've militarized our foreign policy so much that every time there's a problem somewhere in the world, we're always thinking, what can the military do? Can the military build some dams or some irrigation projects? we haven't really developed a system, or we had in the past, but we've kind of marginalized our system for civilian assistance. What kind of a project could we design for civilian help for post-trauma Afghanistan that would be acceptable to that country's rulers? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it is a very good question for our next president to consider.
We're going to take one, we got to wrap it up. I'm getting the knife here from Professor Bluestone. You know, what we haven't, this has been a terrific discussion, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. What we haven't discussed, however, given these two experts on Red Sox Nation, because the negotiations currently going on at Fenway Park for the next manager. And I hope you all read Nick Cafardo's column in the Globe today about a fellow named Brad Osmus. What, Nick, I don't think you know, is that Brad Osmus's grandparents, Adele and Jack Grunzel, were two of a group of about 10 original supporters of Mike Dukakis politically. Their daughter, Linda, Brad Osmus's mother, was a Brookline girl in high school. And Osmus went to Dartmouth. So he's one of our own. He's smart as hell. Not only that, folks, he's a catcher. I was a catcher. I have a great affinity for catchers as managers of major league teams. Keep your eye on us.
I want to thank our guest tonight for what was an absolutely amazing evening. Thank you. Simple issue. Next week we shift to a simple issue for the next 2 weeks. We're going to look at healthcare. But I want to leave you so that we don't leave Kitty on a note of mass pressure. Yes, we have to worry about global recession. Yes, we have to worry about North Korea. Yes, Iran. Yes, Euro debt crisis. Certainly have to be concerned about the global climate crisis, cybercrime, nuclear suitcases, Mali. But there's good news. You know where I'm from. Detroit is one game away.